Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Karen's, and this is my short lecture on Chapter 14 in our textbook about the autonomic nervous system. And this is really just trying to help you make sense of what's in the study guide for this last exam. So, the autonomic nervous system is part of the peripheral nervous system. And more specifically, it's part of the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. So we're talking about how motor information is sent from the central nervous system and out to effectors. So let me go back here, there are actually two motor divisions in the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system, and that deals with motor information going to skeletal muscles. And then we have the autonomic nervous system, which is dealing with different types of effectors, and I'll talk about those in a minute. So other things that are different between the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system, beyond just which effectors they're talking to, the types of pathways that have to be taken to get that motor information to those effectors, and how those effectors, meaning target organs, how are they responding to different neurotransmitters? Are they being excited or not? So let's look at this in a little more detail. So this image is showing you some of those differences between the somatic nervous system up top here and the autonomic nervous system down here. So the first difference is which effectors are these two different systems talking to? The somatic nervous system is talking only to skeletal muscles, so voluntary muscles, whereas the autonomic nervous system is talking to involuntary effectors. So smooth muscle lining different organs, cardiac muscle, and glands that are secreting things. Another way they're different is in the pathways they use to get to those effectors. The somatic nervous system, we have one neuron leaving the central nervous system. The cell body of that motor neuron is in the central nervous system. The axon leaves the central nervous system and heads to an effector, in this case, a skeletal muscle. But in the autonomic nervous system, it takes two motor neurons in succession to reach those effectors. The first neuron in that two neuron series, the cell body, begins in the central nervous system, and the axon leaves out the central nervous system, probably out through a spinal nerve, maybe a cranial nerve. And then synapses somewhere outside of the central nervous system, synapses with the second neuron in the series, and it's the second neuron that reaches the effectors. Now, we had discussed the term ganglion in class. Remember, a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies from neurons that are kind of bunched together in parallel. Well, this will also be the case in the autonomic nervous system. All of these neurons, you don't just have one set of neurons in each nerve. You've got lots of neurons in each nerve, and they all line up with one another in parallel. And those cell bodies of the second neuron in each of these series will end up being kind of localized in the same places. So you have these areas that have these collections of cell bodies. That is the ganglion. Also notice where the ganglia are, that is where the first neuron in this series meets the second neuron. So another way to think about a ganglion is basically a synapse, or where these two neurons are meeting. We can refer then to the first neuron in this series as the preganglionic neuron, and the second neuron is called the postganglionic neuron. This is true for both divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The one exception is when the autonomic nervous system is trying to talk to the adrenal gland, And this is the only time where the autonomic nervous system only needs one neuron to get there. At every other instance, autonomic neurons need two neurons to get from the central nervous system to the effector. The first neuron is called the preganglionic neuron. The second neuron is called the postganglionic neuron. The last way that the somatic and autonomic nervous systems are different is in the effects of the neurotransmitters. So if we're talking about neurons that are trying to send motor information to an effector, to a skeletal muscle, if you're talking about the somatic nervous system, or to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, if you're talking about the autonomic nervous system. In order for a neuron to send a signal to something else, whether it's another neuron or an effector, you need a neurotransmitter to do that. We've already seen this when we were talking about the events at the neuromuscular junction during muscle contraction. So that would be our example of what's going on in the somatic nervous system. We have one motor neuron headed to a skeletal muscle trying to send it a signal, and it does so through the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. We've already seen this. Plus, we also know what the effect of acetylcholine is on skeletal muscles. If acetylcholine gets released into the muscle cell, the muscle is going to contract. So that has an excitatory or stimulatory effect on the effector. But it's a little more complex in the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system can use two different neurotransmitters. It can use acetylcholine. It can also use something called norepinephrine, which is adrenaline. Now, what is the effect of these two neurotransmitters on their target organs? It depends. It depends on the target organ, and it depends on the receptors for those neurotransmitters on the target organ. So sometimes these neurotransmitters will stimulate the target organ, and sometimes they will inhibit. And the end of this chapter talks a little more about that, and I'll post a separate lecture talking about those neurotransmitters. So these are the basic differences. Let's go back to this summary here. The differences between the somatic nervous system, which is talking to skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic nervous system, which is talking to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Let's look at these specific divisions of the autonomic nervous system. There are two different divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. They both will talk to more or less the same target organs, but the messages from each division are opposite one another. And so because these target organs in the autonomic nervous system are receiving motor information or messages from two different divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, we call this dual innervation. It says here, all visceral organs are internal organs. All visceral organs are served by both divisions, but the divisions cause opposite effects. And because of this, that means that each of these divisions has to talk to the target organs separately. They will never send their messages at the same time because their messages are opposite, and if they're sent at the same time, the target organs won't know what to do. So if the sympathetic division is active and sending signals to a particular target organ, the parasympathetic division will be off, and vice versa. And I'm not going to go through the differences in the effects of these two divisions. That's something you can look at on your own. It's fairly straightforward, but I will tell you this. The parasympathetic division is known as the rest and digest system because the purpose of this division is to keep your body energy use as low as possible. So these signals that are going to be sent while you are resting and while you are digesting. Whereas the sympathetic division is the opposite. Its job is to get your body ready for some type of activity. And we refer to that as the fight or flight system. So it's going to excite a lot of things, whereas the parasympathetic division may calm some of those target organs down. All right, there are some anatomical differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. First off, where are these motor neurons coming from? Where in the central nervous system do these motor neurons originate from? If you look at the parasympathetic division on the left, you see that there are motor neurons that are leaving the brainstem and headed to particular effector organs. And then there are motor neurons leaving the sacral division or the sacral part of the spinal cord, headed to a different group of effector organs. So sometimes you can refer to the parasympathetic division as the craniosacral division because the motor information is either coming from some of the cranial nerves in the brainstem or some of those sacral nerves or sacral areas of the spinal cord. Whereas look on the right, in the sympathetic division, the motor neurons are originating somewhere else. They're coming from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord using these spinal nerves in this area. So we refer to the sympathetic division as the thoracolumbar region. Another difference, this is again anatomical differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, is how long the fibers or how long the neurons are. Specifically, looking at the preganglionic neurons. So if we look at parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons, which are in dark purple, again, preganglionic neuron is the first neuron in the 2-neuron series. The preganglionic neurons are very long. Postganglionic neurons are very short. But look at the sympathetic division. Preganglionic neurons in dark green are are shorter, I should say. They're shorter than they are in the parasympathetic division. And therefore, the postganglionic neurons are longer. And because of that, that leads to our last anatomical division or difference between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So because of the differences in the length of the neurons, the ganglia, or where the 2 neurons in each series meet, the locations of those are different as well. So look at this parasympathetic division on the left. Because the preganglionic neurons are so long, then where it meets with the postganglionic neuron, which is the ganglia, those ganglia are very close to the target organs. But if you look in the sympathetic division on the right, because the preganglionic neurons are short, the ganglia where those preganglionic neurons meet with the postganglionic neurons, those ganglia lie a lot closer to the spinal cord and further away from the target organs. And this image actually doesn't really even do the sympathetic division justice. You see this long vertical line here. Those are different ganglia. They really run the length of the spinal cord, and they really are right next to the vertebral column, almost touching the bones of the vertebral column. They're very, very close to that spinal cord. This is table 14.1. This does a nice summary of all those differences we just talked about. Differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, talking both about anatomical differences and physiological differences, meaning what are the effects on the target organs. Let's look at the parasympathetic division in a little more detail. So we said that not only do the preganglionic neurons originate from the cranial region here, brainstem, and the sacral region of the spinal cord, but these preganglionic neurons are very long, and therefore the ganglia, where they meet with the postganglionic neurons, are very close to the target organs. Collectively, we call these ganglia terminal ganglia. Terminal because the location of those ganglia are kind of almost at the end of the line. They're almost at the target organ. There are some specific names for some of those terminal ganglia. Do you have to know those names? Not necessarily. I'm just pointing that out here. You see, there's ciliary ganglion, submandibular ganglion. Those are types of terminal ganglion in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The nerves that these neurons are using to get to their effector organs are named here. Oculomotor nerves are being used, facial nerves are being used, glossopharyngeal nerves, the vagus nerve is being used, and then we have some of the nerves from the spinal cord in the sacral region. Some of those nerves are being used. So like the pelvic splanchnic nerves, some of those nerves you probably did not have to learn for lab, but there are some of these additional nerves that they don't really fall under that category of those 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The sympathetic division, remember, the motor neurons, more specifically the preganglionic motor neurons, originate in the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. The preganglionic neurons are short, the postganglionic neurons are long, and therefore the ganglion, where they meet, actually is very close to the spinal cord. We've got lots of different ganglia where they meet. They have lots of different names. This is a great picture showing you where those ganglia actually are. This is in yellow. You see this vertical structure here that almost looks like kind of like beads on a string, if you will. Those are the different sympathetic trunk, we call sympathetic trunk ganglion. These are the ones that lie very close to the spinal cord. And you see, these are the vertebral bones. They're just outside the vertebral column, those ganglion. Here's where they are relative to the spinal cord, very close. There are other ganglion that are part of the sympathetic division that are not part of this chain here. Sometimes it's called the sympathetic chain, or we call it sympathetic trunk ganglion. That's this long vertical line here you see on the left. That's the sympathetic trunk. But there are some other ganglion that are part of the sympathetic division that are not part of this trunk, and you can see them kind of here. They're a little bit further away from the spinal cord, but not as close to the target organs as you would see in the parasympathetic division. There are different ways that the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division will travel as they leave the spinal cord and head toward the sympathetic trunk ganglion or to a different ganglion. In this example, the preganglionic neuron is leaving the spinal cord through a spinal nerve, and it reaches the sympathetic trunk ganglion, and there it synapses with the postganglionic neuron. Everything is staying on the same level vertically. And then that postganglionic neuron heads to an effector. Sometimes the preganglionic neuron travels out the spinal cord through a spinal nerve and reaches the sympathetic trunk ganglion on its level, but it doesn't synapse there. It'll travel either higher or lower and synapse with the postganglionic neuron on a different level. And then that postganglionic neuron heads to an effector. And then this last example is showing you how sometimes The preganglionic neuron doesn't even use the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Instead, the preganglionic neuron exits the spinal cord through a spinal nerve, goes right through the sympathetic trunk, and instead moves to a ganglion that's further away from the sympathetic trunk, and synapses with its postganglionic neuron there. Sometimes these are called collateral ganglion. Collateral ganglion are not part of the sympathetic trunk ganglion. They're further away from the spinal cord. So collectively we call them collateral ganglion, but there are actually multiple specific types of collateral ganglion. You can see here's the celiac ganglion, here's the superior mesenteric ganglion, here's the inferior mesenteric ganglion. If those preganglionic neurons meet at one of those particular ganglia, they will the postganglionic neuron will go to specific effectors. I think that is all I want to say about this. Again, go back and look at the study guide for lecture exam 3 and focus only, when you're going through this chapter, focus only on those questions, because this is kind of a hefty part of the body. The autonomic nervous system is very complicated. We could probably have an entire class, an entire semester's class just devoted to this. So just stick to the study guide. Use these notes. They're definitely going to help you as you're trying to answer homework questions and trying to find the answers to the study guide questions.